This is a request for Dada Doggy Ian. One night, long ago, in the ancient city of Safed, 3 young men went out for a walk. Reuven, the eldest, was to be married the next day to a beautiful and wealthy maiden, and his companions laughed and joked and teased their friend. The moon was full that night, and the young men decided to leave the beaten path and walk in the thick forest that surrounded the city. The moonlight cast its light into the darkest parts of the forest, and they passed through it fearlessly. At last they reached the riverbank and rested on large rocks near the shore, while they watched the river below. Here they continued to make merry, for they were very light-hearted. It was during this time that one of them noticed something strange nearby. It was an object the size of a finger that stuck out of the earth. They got up to examine it, thinking it was a root. But when they came closer, they saw to their amazement that it was indeed a finger that emerged there. Now on a different night the young men might have felt pity for one buried so near the surface, but filled with high spirits they joked about it instead. One of them said, "Who among us will put a wedding ring on this finger?" And Reuven, the groom-to-be, quickly replied that it must be he, because he was to be the first one to marry. Then, as his friends looked on in amusement, Reuven took off his ring and slipped it on that finger, pronouncing as he did the words, "Harai at imkdeshes li." "You are betrothed to me," 3 times as the law requires. But no sooner did he finish speaking than the finger began to twitch, much to the horror of the young men, who jumped back at the sight. Suddenly the whole hand reached out from the earth, twitching and grasping, and as they stared at it in horror, frozen in place, the ground began to rumble as if the earth were about to open. Suddenly the body of a woman, wearing a tattered shroud, rose out of the earth, her dead eyes staring directly into those of Reuven, her arms open as she cried out, "My husband!" in a terrible and terrifying voice. Hearing this, the 3 friends screamed in horror and took to their heels, running through the forest as fast as they could go. But this time the way was dark, for the moon had slipped behind a cloud, and as they ran they tore their clothes on horns and branches, but never did they stop running or even dare to look back until they reached their homes in the city. For all the time they ran, they heard the unearthly wail of the dead woman close behind. Only when they were safely in their own homes, with the doors locked and the windows shuttered, did they dare breathe a sigh of relief and tend to the many cuts they had acquired in their wild dash through the forest. The next morning, the 3 friends met together, still pale and shaken, and they agreed to keep the horrible events of the night a secret, for they were deeply ashamed of their jest and its terrible consequences. Then Reuven went to the ritual bath to prepare for the wedding, and left his friends alone with their confused thoughts. Now a great many people had gathered, for Reuven and his bride belonged to 2 of the most distinguished families in Safed. But just as the ceremony was about to begin, a blood-curdling shriek came from the back of the crowd, followed by the screams of many others, provoking a panic. For there stood the corpse of a woman wearing only a worm-eaten shroud. Most of the crowd, including the bride and the families of the bride and groom, ran away when they saw her, until none were left there, except for Reuven and the rabbi, who had been about to pronounce the wedding vows. The rabbi, alone among all of those present, retained his composure. He addressed himself to the corpse, and said, "Why is it, woman, that you have left your final resting place, and returned to the living?" And the corpse replied in her unearthly voice, "What blemish does the bridegroom find in me, that he should want to wed another? For cannot all the world to see that he is wed to me?" And she held up her hand, on which the ring of the bridegroom could be seen, with his initials engraved on it. When the rabbi turned to the bridegroom, who was crouched in terror behind him, and asked if what the woman said was true, in a trembling voice the young man told of his walk through the forest with his friends, and of the jest they had played when they found the finger sticking out of the earth. And the rabbi asked, "Did you pronounce the sacred vow 3 times?" The young man meekly nodded, and the rabbi asked, "Was it done in the presence of 2 witnesses?" Again Reuven nodded. Then the rabbi looked very grave and said that the rabbinic court would have to be convened to discuss the matter, for in the eyes of the law it appeared that the young man had indeed bound himself to that corpse in matrimony. When the bridegroom heard these terrible words, he fainted dead away and had to be carried off to his home. In the days that followed, the city of Safed was in an uproar, for who had ever heard of a living man marrying a corpse? And the parents of Reuben begged the rabbi to find a way to free their son from the terrible curse. As for the rabbi, he immersed himself in meditation and in the study of response, searching for a precedent. But there was none. Instead, one would have to be set. On the day the court was convened, the rabbi called upon the corpse to appear, and she did so, still wearing the worm-eaten shroud in which she had been buried. Under oath, she told what young Reuben had done in the forest. Then the rabbi called upon the two friends, who reluctantly confirmed what she said. At last the rabbi called upon the bridegroom, who also confessed the vow had been made, but pleaded with the court to annul the marriage, for he had never intended for it to happen. Then the court addressed the dead woman, and asked her if she would relinquish her claim, but the corpse was adamant that the marriage must be consummated. For while she had lived, she had never married, and had thus been denied her hour of joy, and she was determined to receive after death what she had been denied in life. Then the rabbi called upon the parents of the bridegroom, who testified that the betrothal of their son to the daughter of the wealthy man had been made even before the birth of the children. The two couples had vowed that if one had a boy child and one had a girl, then they were to be wed, and the parents of the bride confirmed this vow. Finally, when all the testimony had been taken, the court gathered together to discuss the case, while young Reuben trembled, his eyes avoiding the terrible corpse that also stood waiting among them. At last the court reached a decision, which the rabbi announced. He said, "It is true that in the presence of two witnesses, Reuben unwittingly made a vow of marriage that appears to be valid." Here the rabbi paused, and the young man and his parents were filled with terror. Then the rabbi continued. There are, however, other factors that must be considered. First, the wedding vow would deny the betrothal, and it is widely known that one vow may not be permitted to negate an earlier one. Second, the vow of the bridegroom was not made with intention. Finally, there is no precedent for a claim on the living by the dead. Therefore, the vows cannot be accepted as valid, because the bride is not from among the living. The marriage is thus declared null and void. Now when the rabbi uttered these words, young Reuben fainted again, this time from relief. But the corpse, having lost her chance to wed either in death or in life, let forth an ear-shattering screech, which pierced the souls of all those assembled there and filled their hearts with horror. Then she collapsed upon the ground and became again as one of the dead. When those assembled had at last calmed down, the rabbi gave orders to have the corpse reburied with proper ritual and at a greater depth, so that such a tragedy would never happen again. And after her burial, the rabbi called upon the parents of the true bride to fulfill the vow they had made before their daughter had been born, and to complete the wedding ceremony, which had been so terribly interrupted. This was done, and at last the wedding of Reuben and his true bride took place. May all your tales end with Shalom. Peace.